Can you ever leave your wealthy father, disown him, and accept poverty for the sake of the gospel? That is the story of Saint Francis of Assisi. In 13th century Italy, when material prosperity defined success and knighthood represented the highest honor a young man could achieve, one privileged youth would turn his back on everything society valued to embrace a beggar's life. Francis of Assisi's story is not just about rejecting wealth, but about discovering that true riches come from surrendering everything to follow Christ with reckless abandon. And in doing so, transforming not just his own life, but the very face of Christianity for centuries to come. Francis was born in 1181, one of the children of Pietro di Bernardone, a prosperous silk merchant, and a French mother, Pica di Berlemont, about whom little is known except that she was a noble woman originally from Provence. Indulged by his parents, Francis lived the high-spirited life typical of a wealthy young man. He was handsome, witty, gallant, and delighted in fine clothes. He spent money lavishly and became the prime favorite among the young nobles of Assisi, the foremost in every feat of arms, the leader of the civil revels, the very king of frolic. In 1202, he took part in a war between Assisi and Perugia, was held prisoner for almost a year, and on his release fell seriously ill. After his recovery, he attempted to join the papal forces in 1205. On his journey, however, he had a vision or dream that bade him return to Assisi and await the call to a new kind of knighthood. Imprisonment and illness had shattered his self-assurance, and instead of reassuring him, the gospel challenged Francis with the still unfamiliar values of Christian discipleship. He was 23 years old. His old way of life and his old friends left him feeling disillusioned and empty. One day in 1206, as Francis, now 24 years old, prayed in the tiny church in San Damiano, Christ spoke to him from the crucifix saying, "Rebuild my church." So Francis set about the task of rebuilding the forsaken wayside chapel. Although he believed that the task of rebuilding the church was just a matter of stones and mortar, his lifestyle changed accordingly. Many people thought that he had gone mad, and his family must have been embarrassed by his behavior. Francis spontaneously began to share his family's wealth with the poor, provoking harsh, angry words from his father and a sullen, hostile silence from the son. The growing friction between Francis and his father exploded publicly in October of 1206, when Pietro Bernardone pursued his son to the central piazza of the city and demanded repayment for all that Francis had squandered in his generosity to the poor. Before all the townspeople gathered there, Francis stripped himself naked, renounced his hereditary rights, and gave his fine clothes back to his astonished father. The Bishop of Assisi, who had witnessed the dramatic gesture, wrapped his cloak around the young man. Completely naked, Francis said, "Until now I have called you my Father on earth. But henceforth I can truly say, Our Father who art in heaven." After accepting his call to live the gospel, during the years of 1207 through 1209, Francis dedicated himself to a life of prayer and solitude. One day, in a singular moment of personal conversion, Francis encountered a leper. Like most of his contemporaries, Francis felt a disdain for lepers and avoided them at all costs. But in a moment of divine grace, he dismounted from his horse, embraced the leper, and kissed him. This act of radical love marked the true beginning of his transformation. Francis soon attracted followers who were drawn to the simplicity and sincerity of his new life. In all, 12 men agreed to follow his way of life, plus countless others who sought him to hear him preach. By his example and preaching, people were inspired by his poverty and began following him. In 1209, Pope Innocent III gave approval for the Franciscan Order. The rule of St. Francis stressed the need to imitate the life of Jesus. The group, then the Lesser Brothers, were centered in the Porziuncula and preached first in Umbria, before expanding throughout Italy. Hearing Francis preaching in the Church of San Rufino in Assisi in 1211, the young noblewoman Clare of Assisi sought to live like them. On the night of Palm Sunday, March 28, 1212, Clare clandestinely left her family's palace. Francis received her and several other young women and placed them in a monastery where they developed a contemplative rule which expressed their commitment to peace, to prayer, and to solitude. By successfully integrating Franciscan spirituality with the monastic lifestyle, Clare of Assisi proved to be one of the great religious innovators of her age. This became known as the Poor Clares. In many ways a mystic, Francis viewed all nature as a mirror of God, calling all creatures his brothers and sisters. He celebrated Christmas in 1223 by creating the first known nativity scene at Greccio, using real animals so that worshippers could contemplate the birth of the child Jesus in a direct way. In 1219, he went to Egypt, preached to the Sultan, and visited the holy places of Jerusalem. He earned a reputation among the Muslims as a peaceful preacher, and only the Franciscans were allowed to remain in the Holy Land as custodians when the Muslim conquest of the region occurred. The pinnacle of Francis's spiritual journey came in 1224. In the summer of that year, Francis went to the mountain retreat of La Verna, not far from Assisi, to celebrate the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and to prepare for St. Michael's Day by fasting for 40 days. He was struggling physically and spiritually, feeling that his order was being taken out of his hands. He felt that he was a failure, too weak in body to do much preaching. During his time at La Verna, Francis prayed with intensity. He asked for the grace to participate in the suffering of Christ in his own body. While praying, he received a vision of a seraph with 6 wings, bearing the image of the crucified Christ. As it stood above him, he saw that it was a man and yet a seraph with 6 wings. His arms were extended and his feet conjoined, and his body was fixed to a cross. The face was beautiful beyond all earthly beauty, and it smiled gently upon Francis. Then, as the vision disappeared, it left not only a greater ardor of love in the inner man, but no less marvelously marked him outwardly with the stigmata of the crucified. When the vision ended, St. Francis realized that he had received the stigmata, the miraculous impressions in his own flesh of the wounds of Jesus Christ. The nail prints appeared in his hands and feet with the nails, and a wound piercing his side from which flowed blood. For the remainder of his life, Francis took the greatest care to hide the stigmata. The saint allowed only a few followers to see and care for the wounds, which actively bled and caused real pain. Francis lived 2 years longer, in constant pain and almost totally blind, as he had contracted an eye disease while proselytizing in the East in 1219. Medical treatment at Rieti was unsuccessful, and after a stay at Siena, he was brought back to Assisi. He died at the Porziuncola on October 3, 1226, at the age of 44. Later, Brother Leo, the confessor and intimate companion of the saint, said that in death Francis seemed like one just taken down from the cross. He was canonized by Pope Gregory IX on July 16, 1228, who laid the foundation stone for the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. When Francis died, the Franciscan Order lived on. Throughout history, Franciscans have been sent on pilgrimages throughout the world to bring its people to Christ. They were sent to the Americas, where many of his followers founded missions in what is now the southwestern states and California. Cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Antonio were named in honor of this saint. In 2013, the Jesuit Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio chose Francis as his papal name in honor of St. Francis of Assisi. At his first media audience, Pope Francis said of St. Francis of Assisi, "He is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation." These days we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we? He is the man who gives us this spirit of peace, the poor man. How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. The story of Francis of Assisi teaches us that true greatness often requires the courage to walk away from what the world considers valuable. The wealthy merchant's son who had everything became the poor man of Assisi who possessed nothing yet influenced millions. His radical embrace of poverty was not about rejecting God's good gifts, but about removing every obstacle between himself and complete devotion to Christ. The stigmata he received was not a reward for his piety, but a sign that his identification with Christ had become so complete that even his body bore witness to it. Francis showed the world that the gospel taken seriously will always look radical, countercultural, and utterly transformative. His legacy reminds us that the greatest revolution is not fought with weapons, but with love not achieved through power, but through humility, and not measured by what we accumulate, but by what we are willing to surrender for the sake of following Jesus.